You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. When I started researching sexual fantasies for my book, Tell Me What You Want, one of the things I wanted to explore was what happens when fantasies move beyond being a solitary experience. Almost every study on fantasies that had been conducted up to that point looked at fantasies as this thing that we only do in private. But what happens when we decide to share or maybe even act on our fantasies? In today's show, we're going to look at what the data say. Some of the topics we'll explore include how many people have ever shared their fantasies with a partner before, the 5 most common reasons that people decide to share their fantasies, the factors that motivate some people to keep their fantasies secret, as well as how partners usually react when fantasies are shared. So let's talk about fantasies. I am joined by Matthew Kimberly, a lecturer in psychology at Birmingham City University. He researches sexual fantasies and also leads the Gender, Sexuality, and Intimate Relationships Research Lab. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. For nearly 80 years, the Kinsey Institute has been the place where sex and relationships are understood. Now, you can help advance its expert-led research. This month, the Match Group is offering an incredible 2-to-1 match for all gifts to the Kinsey Institute Research Fund in recognition of its vital impact. Your donation will help fund important research on topics such as sexual well-being and aging, sexual assault prevention, shifting dating trends, and the impact of AI and technology on relationships. Donate now to help maintain the Kinsey Institute as the global hub to explore, discover, and share knowledge about sexuality, relationships, and human behavior. Be part of this crowdfunding campaign and make your gift to the Kinsey Institute Research Fund go further this October. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to participate in the Make Your Match campaign and support sex science. Hi, Matt, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to speak with you. And we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics today, which is sexual fantasies, and specifically what happens when people share them with a partner. But before we get into that, let me first ask, what got you interested in researching the topic of sexual fantasies in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of finishing my undergrad degree, and it was around the time that your book came out. And there was kind of one statistic in particular that really shot out to me. It was most people wanted to try their fantasy. I want to say like 8 out of 10 people, but only a third reported actually having done so. And then that got me thinking, well, is this the case that they're sharing this fantasy with a partner and their partner is then responding negatively, or, they're not interested and that's kind of leading to not trying out the fantasy? Is it that they're just not sharing the fantasy? So then I kind of started having a look at the literature around sexual fantasy disclosure and actually how likely is it for someone to share a fantasy, what predicts whether someone shares or doesn't share. And actually there wasn't much out there. I think there were 2 papers, if that. So that kind of made me think there's this huge gap, and actually sexual communication research has focused on lots of different topics, but sexual fantasy disclosure seems to have been kind of missed somehow, or it's been kind of placed within this wider category of sexual communication. But actually the risks and the rewards are very different. So if you're sharing previous relationship experiences, actually that's going to have very different rewards to sharing a fantasy of a threesome, for example.
Yeah, makes total sense to me. And, when I got into the area of studying sexual fantasies, I noticed the same thing, which was that almost all of the data that's out there is about fantasies as a solitary experience, something that you just think about in your head and that maybe you focus on while you're masturbating or having sex, and very little about, what happens when fantasy enters real life? Like what happens when we actually share a fantasy with a partner or decide to act on it? And so little research and data out there on it. So that got me into wanting to ask about that. And I'm glad you followed up on it because, like you said, there's very little data on this. So it's good to have it explored in greater depth and nuance. So you recently published a study in the Journal of Sex Research on this topic of fantasy disclosure. But before we get to the findings, can you just tell us a little bit about who you surveyed and what kinds of questions you asked people?
Absolutely. So it was predominantly an open-ended survey that we distributed through Reddit, through the Sex and Psychology website, through kind of other forms of social media. And then it was open to students at the University of Staffordshire, where I did my PhD. So it's quite a diverse sample, ranging from 18 to, I think, 83, 84, and relatively diverse in terms of sexuality and gender. Initially, participants they were provided with a definition of sexual fantasies and asked to think of one specific fantasy. And we left that quite broad deliberately because we wanted some to imagine a fantasy they disclosed, some a fantasy they hadn't disclosed, them to vary in terms of whether it was a recent or a prominent fantasy. And then we asked them to describe either their reasons for disclosing or not disclosing the fantasy. And then again, if they disclosed whether this was a positive or a negative experience, so kind of what the experience looked like. And then if they hadn't disclosed, what they felt it would look like if they were to ask their partner. And then we asked them kind of follow-up Likert scale questions where participants rated the positivity of their anticipated partner response or their actual partner response and the kind of likelihood of disclosing in the future.
So, how many people said that they had ever shared a fantasy with a partner before? And did that number surprise you, or was it kind of what you expected?
So, for this study, we didn't ask about whether they had previously disclosed or not disclosed. Just under 80% of participants were answering the survey based on a fantasy that they had previously shared with a partner, though in a follow-up study, 92% of participants indicated that they disclosed a sexual fantasy in the future at some point, which I guess considering the diversity in fantasy content, for some participants that could just be something quite mild, like kissing their partner in a new location. And that can kind of vary dramatically across the relationship and between people. But within that same survey, over half, so 55% of participants also indicated having an undisclosed fantasy. We have this idea generally with communication that people either struggle or they're very capable of communicating, and it can be very dependent on the content of actually what they're disclosing. So some fantasies are very easy to disclose. The anticipated threat and the anticipated negative response from partners is seen as kind of very unlikely. Whereas for others, when kind of deciding whether to disclose or not disclose, actually the risks of doing so may outweigh the potential reward of being able to enact that fantasy. And for some participants as well, within kind of the published study, they also kind of indicated that actually part of their reason for not disclosing was because they didn't want to try out the fantasy. So they weren't intending to enact it, and actually doing so would be a negative experience.
Yeah. So most people don't have just one fantasy, right? And when it comes to sharing fantasies, we might choose to share some of them, but not others. And, as you just explained, like it's this complex and highly nuanced thing. Like maybe there are reasons why we would share one type of fantasy, but not another. And we'll get into some of those reasons in a little bit. But what you find is that, there are really 5 main reasons that people report for either sharing or not sharing their fantasy with a partner. So let's kind of walk through them one by one. And we'll start with the most common reason that people reported for sharing a fantasy, which was sexual gratification. And I think that's probably not super surprising. So what kinds of things were people hoping would happen to their sex life if they shared their fantasy with a partner?
So the most common was that they'd be able to act out the fantasy, that their partner would kind of agree and they would go about trying it. For some participants who kind of were categorized within that category, the actual process of disclosing was also arousing. So actually, whether they enacted the fantasy or not, it might be that they mentioned it during sex or prior to sex, and actually just sharing that fantasy in general was arousing. or it might be to learn more about their partner, about their partner's likes and dislikes, which kind of aligns very well with kind of historical sexual communication research like Byers and Demons, 1999, who kind of looked at how sexual communication can predict sexual satisfaction and that kind of extrinsic and intrinsic roots to doing so. It kind of links very nicely through that development of that mutual sexual script within the relationship. But then conversely, within the same category, participants also indicated it's not something that they actually wanted to act out, or it wouldn't be a positive experience, or it just wasn't possible. So their fantasy wasn't something that they were physically able to act out.
Yeah. So when people perceive their fantasy as a desire, right? So when it's something they really want to do, it's a wish or a want for their sex life, then they might share it with their partner precisely because they hope that it's going to become a reality. But, as you just mentioned, sharing fantasies in and of themselves can also be this form of dirty talk. And sometimes there's no desire to actually do it, but just talking about the fantasy can be a turn on in and of itself. But also by the same token, like you said, some people have no desire to ever act out that fantasy. And also that can be a reason why they don't share it, because they just don't want it to become part of their sex life. And also because sometimes when we share a fantasy, even if it's something we don't want to do, we might still expect that our partner is going to assume that we want to do that, right? And so I think I recall reading in some of your work that people sometimes said that, well, I don't want to share this because I don't want my partner to feel pressured to do this. And also, I don't really even want to do it anyway, right? So sometimes people feel like it's better to keep it secret because it's just not something that they want to come across as a potential source of conflict in the relationship. So beyond sexual fulfillment, another reason for fantasy disclosure or lack thereof was that it was motivated by the relationship itself. So talk to us a little bit about that. What are some of the relationship-specific factors that make people more or less likely to share their fantasies?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reasons for disclosing a fantasy are kind of relatively what you'd expect, and it kind of aligns with a lot of the sexual communication, sexual self-disclosure research. So kind of wanting to disclose because generally you trust your partner and you trust that they will respond in a positive manner, or that you love them and you kind of have this idea that they'll respond very positively. Some participants also reported sharing their fantasy because they were in longer relationships and they felt that their partner was more entitled to know based on that kind of longevity of the relationship. But then conversely to this, there was this kind of idea that actually within some relationships, disclosing held this kind of threat. So if you tell your partner something and actually they don't want to try it, they see it quite negatively, it's taboo or it's extreme, actually they may respond very negatively. It could cause an argument, and that might then potentially bring about the end of the relationship, or it could kind of threaten the relationship's security. Very similarly, participants who were in newer relationships were also unlikely to share their fantasies. They kind of reported that the trust or the love hadn't established yet. And that kind of led them to not feel secure in sharing those fantasies with their partner.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And it's consistent with what I've found in my own research, where I found that people who are in more satisfying and healthier relationships to begin with tend to be more inclined to share their fantasies with a partner. And, it makes sense that if you're in an atmosphere where there's more trust and intimacy and security and stability, that increases the odds that you're going to want to be vulnerable and share a fantasy. And by the same token, by the process of sharing fantasies and engaging in self-disclosure, that can go back and further increase your satisfaction and comfort and happiness in the relationship. So totally makes sense that characteristics of the relationship are going to predict whether or not people share their fantasies. And this is also why when I give my workshops and lectures on fantasies, I say that before you get to sharing fantasies, it's usually a good idea to work on the relationship first and work on your communication patterns. Because if you don't have the trust and intimacy and solid communication in the first place, it's probably not going to go super well when it comes to something like sharing sexual fantasies. So usually work on the relationship first before you get to the point of sharing fantasies. Don't just share fantasies as a way of trying to save a failing relationship, because there are lots of cases where that might not work out so well. So, another factor that influences whether people share their fantasies are the communication patterns in their relationship. So, how does the general communication dynamic between partners influence whether they choose to share their fantasies or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So the most commonly reported reason within this category was that participants had disclosed because they had this kind of well established open communication style. So it's kind of been developed very similar to what you were saying a second ago. Kind of it'd been developed over time. They'd worked on the relationship, and that kind of led them to feel comfortable sharing information. And over time, this became further and further in depth and eventually kind of led to the discussion of sexual fantasies and being able to kind of freely share these with partners. And it also kind of then led to disclosing with the intent of a partner then sharing their own fantasies or partners sharing with the intent that you then share your own with them. So it's kind of this reciprocal process where both partners work together to develop the relationship and increase how many topics they're able to share with one another. And we can kind of see on the flip side where this hasn't worked out. So where previous disclosures have been negative, partners responding in a judgmental or a critical way. Actually, this was then cited as a reason for not sharing with their partner. And on the flip side as well, I think very inherently with the topic of sexuality and sexual behavior, a lot of people experience embarrassment or discomfort talking about sex, which has been kind of ingratiated through society for thousands of years. And it's inherent, especially within newer relationships or people who are just less comfortable talking about sex. It can be a difficult topic to talk about.
Yeah. So, when it comes to how your partner responds the first time you share a fantasy, like that is really important. If your partner responds in a way that is judgmental or shaming, that's probably going to shut off any future possibility of you sharing more fantasies, right? And so, I often talk about this in my lectures and workshops about fantasies is that when a partner shares a fantasy with you, the first thing that you should do is to thank them for sharing that, right? Because I think sharing fantasies is something that can be really hard for a lot of people. And oftentimes, like when they're sharing a fantasy with you, you might be the very first person they've ever told about this in their entire life. And so if you respond in that way with kindness, as opposed to judgment and shaming, that's going to make your partner feel safer and increase the odds that you can talk further about other issues related to your sex life. But when you start with the shaming and blaming and judging and all that kind of stuff, it does not tend to go well. So yeah, again, it goes back to having the good general communication patterns and, responding with positivity as opposed to judgment when you're having sexual discussions with a partner.
So we also asked participants how their partner responded. And of those who disclosed a fantasy, the majority, over 80%, indicated it was a positive experience. And even where that experience wasn't enacting the fantasy and kind of trying it out, it was very much like you were saying of their partner kind of being open, talking about it, and then their partner not acting in a judgmental or shaming way, but also expressing, that's great. It's not something that I'm interested in trying, but thank you for sharing. So it's very similar to what you were saying about having that positive response, even if it isn't enactment.
Yeah, it makes total sense, right? And it's consistent with what I see in my research too, which is that when it comes to sharing fantasies, the vast majority of people are reporting positive experiences with this and that it improved their relationship. And, if they did further go the actual step of acting on the fantasy, generally that was a good experience too, and something that strengthened the relationship and brought sexual fulfillment. So, there can be lots of benefits when it comes to sharing fantasies, but, in terms of whether that's going to be a positive experience for the relationship or not, is going to depend a lot on the partner's reaction. When I was younger, I could fall asleep just about anywhere and still bounce back the next day. I could even sleep on the floor and wake up feeling totally fine. But those days are long gone. I need to be really comfortable in order to get good quality sleep. Otherwise, the next day is just going to be a hot mess. So when I realized that my old mattress just wasn't keeping up with me anymore, I knew that I had to make a change. And that's when I switched to Brooklyn bedding. It has been a total reset for my sleep. I wake up feeling good and mentally sharp, and I don't need to grab a coffee before I let my partner talk to me, which is good for our relationship. Brooklyn Bedding handcrafts each and every mattress right here in the USA, and they have a mattress for every body and sleep style so that you can find one that's just right for you. Take their sleep quiz and find your perfect match in minutes. Awarded Best Mattress by CNET and Best Hybrid Mattress by Wirecutter, Brooklyn Bedding is the real deal. Go to brooklynbedding.com and use my promo code Justin at checkout to get 30% off site-wide. This offer is not available anywhere else. That's brooklynbedding.com and promo code Justin for 30% off site-wide. Make sure you enter our show name after checkout so that they know we sent you. brooklynbedding.com, promo code Justin. Circling back to the other factors that predict fantasy disclosure, tell us a little bit about how the traits of your partner might influence whether you decide to share a fantasy.
Absolutely. So, kind of very similar. So, this was cited less frequently as a reason for disclosing, but where it was that they described their partner as very open, very supportive, and that then led them to feel comfortable. The biggest reasons within this category were that their partner had responded very negatively or critically to previous disclosures, or that they had expressed very negative attitudes to similar sexual fantasies or similar kind of sexual behavior. And that then led them to anticipate this kind of very negative response where if they were to share that with their partner would behave in a very similar manner.
Yeah, so our understanding, our knowledge of our partners and, how they've responded to discussions about sex in the past, or even, how they've responded to portrayals of sex in the media and the movies and on TV can give you some kind of clue or indication as to how they might respond if you were to share a fantasy about a particular sexual activity. And if your partner has responded in a way that's kind of judgmental about, let's say, kink in terms of a portrayal that they saw in the media, then that's probably going to make it less likely that you'd share a fantasy about kink with your partner. So what we know about our partner often gives us a pretty good clue as to how they're going to respond to the types of fantasies that we might share with them. Now, the final reason for disclosure was that it depended on the nature of the fantasy itself. So basically, people often made the decision to share or withhold a fantasy based on what the content of that fantasy was. So what kinds of content prompted people to share and what prompted them to keep it secret?
So within the category of specific fantasy content, whilst it wasn't possible to kind of make really concrete decisions of this is a fantasy that's kind of really commonly shared or not shared with a partner, what we did find is that there were some traits that kind of made it more likely. So the first being whether the described fantasy was really central to someone's sexual identity. So kink, for example, whilst it can be something that you do occasionally or you just do sexually, it can also be something that's very pivotal to your identity. Very similarly, if it's linked to kind of sexual orientation. So if your fantasy is related to having sex with someone of the same sex, but you're currently in a heterosexual relationship, actually, that can also be very pivotal to who you are sexually and your sexual identity. And not sharing these, whether you enact them or not, can be attributed to this internal conflict. And some participants reported going through this initial stage of almost screening partners. So disclosing very early on to make sure that the partner is on board and shares this fantasy, or is at least okay with them having the fantasy and isn't going to respond negatively down the line. And very similar where fantasies were experienced for very long periods of time, it kind of led to this kind of imperative to disclose. So the longer you had the fantasy, the more likely you were to disclose eventually. I'd say on the caveat to this, if it's a fantasy that you have currently, but actually maybe you don't want to try, or you're actively aware that your partner is likely to respond in a very negative way or not approve, you may then not share that fantasy. What we also found is that where fantasies were kind of deemed to be societally taboo or extreme or something that their partner was very likely to disapprove or society would disapprove of if it came out, actually this was seen as a threat to the relationship. And then they actively made the decision to conceal the fantasy on the basis of having this relationship protecting effect.
That all makes total sense. Like, if the fantasy is something that is really central to who you are as a sexual being, it makes perfect sense that people would be more inclined to share that fantasy. But by the same token, I've also seen lots of cases where people have been in long-term relationships where they have a fantasy, let's say about kink or a fetish, that is very central to who they are and how they experience their sexuality. And they don't share it with their partner, and it doesn't come out until 10 or 20 years into the relationship. And then it becomes like this really huge thing, right? Because now it's this secret that you've been keeping for a really long time. And so, when it comes to fantasies that are really central to who you are, generally speaking, better to disclose them earlier in the relationship rather than later on, because when they become this long held secret, it can become this huge source of conflict and tension in the relationship. And also, your findings here are consistent with what I see in my own data too, which is that when people don't evaluate the risk to reward ratio very favorably, then, they're less inclined to share fantasies. So, when the fantasy, let's say, would carry a lot of risk, like let's say it's about opening up the relationship and you're worried that if you did so, that would then lead your partner to leave you for someone else, then people tend not to share those kinds of fantasies. It's not to say that fantasies about opening up can never work out, of course. It's just to say that it depends on you and your individual subjective evaluation of, what are the potential risks? What are the potential rewards? And what am I worried about in terms of sharing the fantasy? And if you see that the risks are just too much for you, people tend not to share or disclose those types of fantasies either. So we talked a little bit about how, partners respond, and more often than not, they respond positively rather than negatively. But what about the people who have never shared their fantasy before? You ask them, how do you think your partner would respond if you were to share this fantasy? So what did people think their partner would say if they were to share that fantasy? What kind of reaction were they expecting?
So largely they were more likely to expect a negative reaction from their partner. So for those who disclosed, only around 8% of participants recorded that their partner had responded in a negative way. Whereas for those who hadn't shared the fantasy of a partner, but were kind of reflecting on how they felt their partner would respond, 50% of those who were responding indicate that they felt their partner would respond in a negative way. And within these responses, the negativity was also greater. So for those who disclosed, it might be kind of more mild negativity, like very blunt, or just kind of immediately ruled out the fantasy without having that kind of positive experience beforehand of thanking them and before moving on the conversation. Whereas for those who were reflecting on anticipated fantasies, it may be more that they felt their partner would actively discriminate against them or would actively disapprove or mock them or criticize them based on the fantasy content. For some, they also felt that this would have wider social consequences, so their partner might share their fantasy with friends or colleagues or family members, or force them into counseling that they didn't feel was necessary or would help the relationship. And within those who responded in a way that wasn't, that they felt their partner would respond in a negative way, it was relatively evenly split between those who felt their partner would respond positively. So generally, they reported that their partner would act out the fantasy, or they'd be understanding. They just hadn't got around to disclosing yet, or it was still an early stage in the relationship, or that they felt their partner would respond quite neutrally. So they would not share the fantasy, not want to act out the fantasy, but also wouldn't be open to having that continued communication and would kind of rule it out very quickly. So I think there's two kind of really interesting things. So the first being this increase in anticipated negativity, which is we see very similarly for other forms of communication around kind of high risk or taboo or potentially societally disapproved of topics, where people avoid disclosing because they anticipate that their partner's likely to respond in a very negative way or have these kind of wider social consequences. But then conversely, there's also the chance that because we haven't directly asked participants for the content of their fantasy, that those negative anticipated responses could be very realistic. So they could be more likely to have this negative response. And they've made the active decision based on their evaluation of the risks to the relationship and the risk to themselves based on disclosing, like we were saying earlier. So I guess it's this kind of consideration of relationship versus individual risks associated with disclosing.
Yeah. And I think people's anticipated reactions are very telling of why they haven't shared the fantasy in the first place, right? The fact that most of them were expecting a negative reaction is consistent with what I see in my own research too, which is that they don't expect their partner would respond favorably. So why are they going to share the fantasy and, set themselves up to be in a situation where they might be judged or shamed by their partner? But also, it's clear that a lot of people just have a lot of general fear and uncertainty around sharing their fantasies. They're worried about what happens when this fantasy gets out there. Like, even if they share it with their partner, what if their partner tells someone else, right? And, I see that in my data as well, that people are sometimes worried about, well, what would happen if my family or friends or just other people that I know find out that I'm into this thing? And then how is that going to change how they see me? And will I be discriminated against or marginalized for, having this unconventional sexual interest? So there's lots of fear and uncertainty that holds people back from sharing their fantasies as well. So what does all of this research tell us in terms of whether sharing fantasies is a good idea or not? A lot of people ask me, should I share my fantasies or not? And I think I know what your answer is going to be, which is that it depends, right? Because it's a complex, highly nuanced topic, right? And different people have different experiences and different reasons for disclosing. But I don't know, what do you think? If someone were to ask you, should I share my fantasies or not? What would you say?
I think I'd almost suggest making like a pros and cons list to doing both, because ultimately each person knows their relationship the best. So we can go based on the data, we can go based on percentages, but actually what this study and the kind of later studies from my PhD have demonstrated is this overarching influence of anticipated relational threats. So if disclosing is perceived as likely to threaten the relationship, there's a real chance that it might, or that it might have a negative response, even if it isn't as negative as anticipated. So I guess it's kind of almost saying, if I were never to share this fantasy with a partner and would never be able to act it out, how would I feel? What influence would this have on me as a person? Would I still be able to be satisfied without ever acting out this fantasy or sharing it? But then also kind of thinking, if I share this and it does have this negative response and it goes very badly, is that almost a risk that's worth taking? That's kind of something that's very prominent. So there's a theory called the revelation risk model of communication, if you're familiar with it, that really highlights almost this kind of decision making of different levels of threat associated with communication and how that then influences decisions that are made, and kind of then also bringing in motivation. So actually, why is it that the person wants to share the fantasy? So is it that it's something that's kind of very central that they can't live without? Is it just kind of something very fleeting that actually has very little consequence but could hold a lot of risk? Is it a fantasy that they've had that actually is linked to a lot of shame or guilt, or they found quite upsetting or distressing, and actually they're disclosing because they want to receive support from a partner? So I guess it's this very nuanced decision taking into account the relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. That the question of whether you should share your fantasies or not is one that only you can answer, because you know yourself and your fantasy and your partner better than anyone else. And it starts first with doing that risk reward evaluation. What's the potential best case scenario here if I share this fantasy? And also, what's the worst case scenario? And you have to balance those two things and see what you feel comfortable with. And, something else to consider is that maybe when it comes to sharing fantasies, maybe start by sharing a lower stakes fantasy first and see how that goes. So something maybe that's more at the vanilla end of the spectrum, as opposed to sharing your wildest or kinkiest or most extreme fantasy right off the bat, right? So there are all different kinds of ways that people can approach this. But I think it really starts with those questions you ask yourself first of, How important is this fantasy to me? How central is this to my identity, to my sexuality? And then what are the potential risks and rewards? And is it worth the risk to share this fantasy in order to tap into or to access those rewards? So thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us, Matt. I'm really looking forward to diving even further into the subject of fantasies with you in the next episode. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on X and Blue Sky at MLKimberly99. There's also the Gender, Sexuality, and Intimate Relationships Research Lab at Birmingham City University, where we have kind of the web page and you can kind of see publications that are coming out. Also, feel free just to drop me an email if you're kind of interested in hearing more or potentially collaborating.
Well, great. And I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.